What does an economic collapse look like, and why can't mainstream analysts and economists see the same disaster we see on the horizon?
We're also going to be looking at softer earnings ahead. It's going to need to cool down the economy enough.
Compare that to the year before. This is a really strong economy.
Last week, I found an article on Zero Hedge written by Brandon Smith of altmarkets.us, which cuts through all of the noise and addresses head-on the 5 stages of denial that skeptics go through when faced with an economic collapse, such as what we're experiencing right now. I'm sure you have someone in your life who you've tried to warn about what's happening or what's coming next, whether it's faulty job numbers, bank failures, inflation, only to be met with denial even in the face of proof. Well, because this has happened to so many of us, I reached out to Brandon and he agreed to let me use his article today for this video because it's such an important conversation to have, especially given everything that's going on. And before we dive into the 5 stages, it's important to remember that an economic collapse isn't an event, it's a process. Now, it's easy for most people to picture economic collapse as an event that happens all at once, like the stock market crash of 1929 in the Great Depression, but there were many warning signs and indicators that led up to that moment. People just chose to ignore them. This ignoring of warnings and indicators also applies to post-crash thinking. After a crash, you'll hear the media and establishment economists saying that recovery is right around the corner. But somehow, that recovery never materializes, or when it does, it takes decades. Often, the full effect of the crash isn't even realized until years and years later. And even though all of the indicators are there to let us know that recovery is not right around the corner, they insist on shouting it regardless. The takeaway being that mainstream experts are often wrong. They don't want to believe that the economy is broken. They are trying to keep the peace, trying to keep the status quo, even if things are not normal and the indicators say otherwise. No, we are not in a Great Depression situation. No, we are not in hyperinflation like Venezuela or Weimar Germany, but we are in a situation that is not normal. The warning signs are there, and it happens slowly until it happens suddenly, kind of like the buildup of an avalanche. Another reason why people don't see what's coming is the danger of moving goalposts. People get used to poor economic conditions, and that becomes the new normal. Take a gallon of gas, for example. In June of 2022, 1 gallon of gas in the US on average was about $5. Today, that same gallon of gas is $3.75. So for many people, that feels like a win. Oh, well, it's under $4, it's in the threes. But they forget that in 2019, that gallon of gas was $2.50. What once would have been considered an extreme price now feels like somewhat of a win, or at least, if nothing else, normal. Even if it's not. The same goes for home prices, wage growth, you name it, people become accustomed to what they're used to. Ultimately, it's not uncommon for the public who have gotten used to their circumstances to then turn around and point fingers at people who are ringing the alarm bell, labeling them as fearmongers or saying that they don't know what they're talking about. The sad reality is that those of us who are ringing the alarm bell don't want to be right. But the truth is that we often are. I know myself personally have had many circumstances where I have tried to warn loved ones, and later they have come to me and said, "You were right, I wish I had taken action earlier." Until that day happens for everyone, in the meantime, these are the 5 stages of denial that people go through when faced with admitting that financial crisis is upon them. Stage 1. I don't know what the conspiracy theorists are talking about. I'm doing fine. If someone is doing all right, even if the rest of the country is struggling, they are far less likely to admit that there's a problem. People are very willing to ignore the sinking of the Titanic if they have their own lifeboat. We see it today with generational differences. Younger generations blaming the older generation for ruining the economy. Older generations blaming the younger generation for complaining too much. Neither of which are fully true. What is true is that the younger generations have had less time and a worse economy to build their lifeboat. Doesn't mean that it applies to everyone, and while nothing in economics is fair, anyone who is sitting there and saying that there's not a problem because they're doing just fine needs to take a step back and look at the larger picture. Stage 2. They've been talking about a collapse for years, and we're still here. People have an image of what collapse looks like in their minds, and it's full destruction. Picture soup lines, stock market crash, people burning cash to stay warm. But all of those images that come to mind when we think about an economic collapse are from the end of the collapse, not from the beginning. Look at what's happened in the last 15 years. Starting with 2008 to today, things have changed significantly. In 2008, everything was papered over. And while we didn't feel the effects of that papering over immediately, it is still playing out today. In the last 5 years alone, thanks to overspending, we've lost over 20% of our purchasing power. The signs are there, they just don't happen all at once. Sometimes it takes longer for these things to play out. Stage 3. Maybe things are bad now, but the crisis is transitory. It will be over soon. This is when a shift starts to occur. When the skeptics accept the fact that there is some instability because it's simply too much to ignore. But they still can't fully bring themselves to admit what's going on, so instead, they cope by telling themselves that everything will be okay. The storm will pass, soft landing. You would think at this point that the realization that they were wrong before would open up their eyes to wonder what else could I be wrong about, but instead the opposite happens. They've built up this false reality so strong at this point that actually admitting that a crisis is really here is simply too much to bear. Stage 4. No one saw the crisis coming. Who else saw this argument during the pandemic and the initial inflation spike? The same exact people who said that everything was fine, nothing was going to change. Anyone claiming that things were changing or that things were going to be different were alarmists. Those same people who made fun of the alarmists could not bring themselves to admit that they were wrong. Instead, they pivoted and said, no one saw this coming. There were no warning signs, because otherwise, to admit that they were wrong would admit that they didn't listen to logic. If only someone could have told them of what was going to happen, if only there had been signs. And see, the media loves to play into this as well, as if a lightning bolt comes from out of the sky and events just happen out of thin air, and that no one knew what was coming. Certainly not those alarmists who had been calling it for months. No, not them. And there's a reason why. There's a reason why people love this. No one saw it coming. And it's because people like to believe that they have no power over their circumstances. If you don't have power over your circumstances, then there's nothing you could have done differently because you didn't know. If you had to admit that you knew that people did see it coming and you just didn't listen, well, now you're in a situation where you are responsible for the position you're in today. Stage 5. Everyone saw the crisis coming. The final stage of denial. It's when the economic collapse is so crystal clear, it's towards the end that at this point, no one can deny it anymore. So instead, they saw it coming all along. They knew exactly what was going to happen, because to admit otherwise would mean that those conspiracy theorists, the alarmists, they knew more than they did. And ultimately, they can't have it. They can't ruin everything that they built in their heads. So instead, they will say, I knew that this was going to happen. We all saw it coming. Reputable sources saw it coming. And I'm not surprised at all. Now, of course, this isn't true, but they'll believe it. They'll believe their own lies that they tell themselves, because the realization that they could have been prepared for the greatest economic collapse of their lifetime is simply too much to bear. All of us at ITM Trading believe in education and awareness, because the more people who are aware of what's going on, the more people who are going to be prepared for what's coming next. Listen, you never know what that thing is that's going to impact someone, or what's going to click where someone finally realizes what's going on. So please be sure to share this with a loved one. And if you haven't already, like and subscribe, because it really helps us get the word out. And for those of you who are watching who already see the indicators and the warning signs, make sure you're taking care of yourself and protecting yourself outside of the system now before it's too late, because we know what's coming. And ultimately, if you haven't already, now is the time to take action. So if you're unsure how to do that or you have questions, that's what we're here for. You can click the Calendly link below. It's in the description, and talk to one of our expert analysts who have years of experience in helping people create strategies with physical, tangible gold and silver. Again, I want to give a big shout out to Brandon Smith from altmarkets.us for letting us use his article in this video. Thank you so much, Brandon. Again, if you want to read the whole article, it is linked in the description below. As always, I'm Taylor Kenney with ITM Trading, your trusted source for all things gold, silver, and lifelong wealth protection. Until next time.